Are we approaching martial law? Look, no one wants to be that guy, right? The one who sees a pigeon wearing a hat and immediately screams, "The government is training birds to spy on us. We're headed for martial law." But here's the thing, sometimes a pigeon in a hat is just unsettling. We're talking about the M word here, martial law. It represents a dramatic shift from civilian rule to military control, and frankly, it's not something to be taken lightly. Now, I'm not saying it's time to start digging bunkers and hoarding gasoline, but what I am saying is, it's important to be aware of the potential warning signs, the subtle shifts in the landscape that might indicate we're headed down a dangerous path. Buckle up, folks, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Imagine this, you're scrolling through the news and suddenly every other headline is screaming about an imminent threat to national security. Sounds scary, right? Now, I'm not saying that genuine threats don't exist, but it's important to pay attention to how the government communicates those threats. When the language becomes excessively alarmist, when officials start using fear-mongering tactics to sow panic and division, it's time to raise an eyebrow. Think about it. If they can convince you that the world is about to end, you're more likely to accept extreme measures, even if those measures infringe on your fundamental liberties. Keep an eye out for phrases like national emergency, existential threat, or unprecedented crisis. So, the next time you see a headline that makes your blood run cold, take a deep breath, engage your critical thinking skills, and ask yourself, is this a genuine threat, or is it the sound of an alarm bell being deliberately misused? Remember those small-town parades where the highlight was the fire truck with the waving Dalmatian? Yeah, me too. But lately those parades have started to look a little different. Instead of friendly firemen, we're seeing heavily armed police officers in armored vehicles, looking like they're ready to storm Normandy. The increasing militarization of local police forces is a worrying trend, one that often precedes the imposition of martial law. When local police departments start acquiring military-grade equipment from assault rifles to armored personnel carriers, it's a sign that they're preparing for something more than just handing out parking tickets. When we equip our police like an occupying army, we shouldn't be surprised if they start acting like one. So, keep an eye on your local police department's budget, attend those city council meetings, and ask yourself, do our streets need more community outreach, or do they need another tank? Look, I'll admit it, I'm not one for conspiracy theories, but there's something undeniably creepy about large-scale training drills, especially when those drills involve the military operating on domestic soil. I'm not talking about your average fire drill here, folks. I'm talking about massive, secretive exercises involving thousands of troops, simulated urban warfare, and black helicopters buzzing overhead. These drills are often shrouded in secrecy, with little to no information provided to the public or even to local law enforcement. When the military starts practicing for scenarios that eerily resemble the imposition of martial law, it's not exactly a comforting thought. Time and time again, governments have used large-scale military exercises as a cover for deploying troops domestically, often as a prelude to cracking down on dissent or consolidating power. So, the next time you hear about a massive military exercise happening in your backyard, don't just shrug it off. Do your research, ask questions, and make sure those in power know that you're paying attention. Remember that time you went to the grocery store for a gallon of milk and came back with a year's supply of toilet paper? No? Just me? Okay, well, the point is, we've all experienced the frustration of empty shelves and supply chain disruptions. But what happens when those disruptions become the norm? What happens when the things we rely on for our daily lives, food, medicine, fuel, become scarce or unavailable? It's a recipe for panic, chaos, and social unrest. And it's a situation that those in power can exploit to justify extreme measures. Think about it. If the government can convince you that the only way to restore order is to hand over more control, you're more likely to comply, even if it means sacrificing your freedoms. Of course, not every supply chain disruption is a sign of impending martial law, but when those disruptions are accompanied by other red flags, increased government surveillance, restrictions on movement, a crackdown on dissent, it's a sign that something is seriously amiss. We need to build more resilient systems, reduce our dependence on single points of failure, and create a society where everyone has access to the resources they need to thrive. Remember those carefree days of your youth, when the only thing that dictated your bedtime was how late you could stay up without your parents catching you? Yeah, me neither. But I'm guessing it wasn't enforced by armed soldiers patrolling the streets. The imposition of curfews is a classic sign of a government tightening its grip on power. It's a way to control the movement of the population, to suppress dissent, and to create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. Now, I'm not saying that all curfews are inherently bad. In some cases, they can be a necessary tool for maintaining order during times of crisis or emergency. But when curfews become the norm, when they're imposed arbitrarily and enforced with excessive force, it's a sign that something is very wrong. Now look, I know this is a sensitive topic. The right to bear arms is a fundamental part of American identity, and it's a right that should be defended. But it's also a right that's often exploited by those in power to justify their own agendas. When governments start talking about disarming the populace, it's time to pay attention. Because more often than not, it's not about public safety, it's about control. Think about it. A disarmed population is a population that's easier to control. It's a population that's less able to resist tyranny, less able to hold those in power accountable, and less able to defend itself against those who would seek to do it harm. So what can you do? Stay informed, and most importantly, hold those in power accountable for their actions. Remember that feeling you get when you realize you've been singing along to a song at the top of your lungs, and you look up to see someone staring at you? Yeah, that's kind of what it feels like to live in a surveillance state. Except it's not just one person staring at you, it's the government. And they're not just listening to your terrible karaoke, they're tracking your every move. From facial recognition software to data mining programs, the tools of surveillance are becoming increasingly sophisticated and pervasive. And while those in power might argue that these tools are necessary to keep us safe, the truth is, they also pose a grave threat to our freedoms. Think about it. When the government has access to your every email, your every phone call, your every online search, it gives them an unprecedented amount of power over your life. They can use that information to manipulate you, to silence you, or to punish you for your beliefs. So what can you do? Well, you can start by becoming more aware of your digital footprint. And remember, the fight for privacy is a fight for freedom. The right to peacefully assemble, to make your voice heard, to challenge those in power, these are the cornerstones of any democracy. But these rights are also incredibly fragile, susceptible to manipulation and exploitation by those who seek to maintain their grip on power. Here's the thing about protests. They make those in power uncomfortable. They expose the cracks in the facade of authority. They highlight the grievances of the people, and they remind those in power that their authority ultimately derives from the consent of the governed. And sometimes those in power respond to that discomfort not by addressing the underlying issues, but by cracking down on the dissent itself. So, what can you do? Well, first and foremost, educate yourself about your rights, and remember, the right to protest is meaningless if you're too afraid to exercise it. Remember that feeling when you were a kid and your parents told you that you could have one cookie, but then you ate the whole sleeve and you knew you were in deep trouble? Yeah, that's kind of what it feels like when a government starts sidestepping checks and balances, except instead of a cookie jar, it's the Constitution, and instead of a timeout, it's the potential collapse of democracy. Checks and balances, the separation of powers, the rule of law, these are the guardrails of democracy, the mechanisms that are supposed to prevent any one person or entity from accumulating too much power. But just like any guardrail, they're only effective if they're respected and maintained. When those in power start ignoring these safeguards, when they start ruling by decree, when they start acting as if they are above the law, it's a sign that democracy itself is under threat. So, what can you do? Well, for starters, you can educate yourself about how your government is supposed to work, and remember, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. So there you have it, folks, a crash course in the potential warning signs of martial law. It's not exactly lighthearted stuff, but it's important to be aware of the challenges we face as a society. Remember, democracies are fragile things, but here's the good news. We're not powerless. By staying informed, by engaging in respectful dialogue, and by never taking our freedoms for granted, we can work together to protect the principles of a free and just society.